There was not an inch of room for Lottie and Kezia in the buggy. When Pat swung them up on top of the luggage, they wobbled. The grandmother's lap was full, and Linda Burnell could not possibly have held a lump of a child on hers for any distance. Isabel, very superior, was perched beside the new handyman on the driver's seat. Holdalls, bags, boxes were piled upon the floor. "These are absolute necessities, and I will not let them out of my sight for one instant," said Linda Burnell, her voice trembling with fatigue and excitement. Lottie and Kezia stood on the patch of lawn just inside the gate, all ready for the fray in their coats with brass anchor buttons and little round caps with battleship ribbons. Hand in hand, they stared with round, solemn eyes, first at the absolute necessities, and then at their mother. We shall simply have to leave them. That is all. We shall simply have to cast them off," said Linda Burnell. A strange little laugh flew from her lips. She leaned back against the buttoned leather cushions and shut her eyes, her lips trembling with laughter. Happily, at that moment, Mrs. Samuel Josephs, who'd been watching the scene from behind her drawing-room blind, waddled down the garden path. "Why not leave the children with me for the afternoon, Mrs. Burnell? They could go on the dray with the storeman when he comes in the evening. Those things on the path have to go, don't they?" "Oh, yes, everything outside the house is supposed to go," said Linda Burnell, and she waved a little white hand at the tables and chairs standing on their heads on the front lawn. How absurd they looked. Either they ought to be the other way up, or Lottie and Kezia ought to stand on their heads too. And she longed to say, "Stand on your heads, children, and wait for the storeman." It seemed to her that that would be so exquisitely funny that she could not attend to Mrs. Samuel Josephs. The fat, creaking body leaned across the gate, and the big jelly of her face smiled. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Burnell. Lottie and Kezia can have tea with my children in the nursery, and I'll see them on the dray afterwards." The grandmother considered. "Yes, it really is quite the best plan. We were very obliged to you, Mrs. Samuel Josephs. Children, say thank you to Mrs. Samuel Josephs." Two subdued chirrups. "Thank you, Mrs. Samuel Josephs." "And be good little girls and come closer," they advanced. "Don't forget to tell Mrs. Samuel Josephs when you want to—" "No, Grandma." "Don't worry, Mrs. Burnell." At the last moment, Kezia let go of Lottie's hands and darted towards the buggy. "I want to kiss my grandma goodbye again." But she was too late. The buggy rolled off up the road, Isabel bursting with pride, her nose turned up at the whole of the world, Linda Burnell prostrated, and the grandmother rummaging among the very curious oddments that she had put in her black silk reticule at the last moment for something to give to her daughter. The buggy twinkled away in the sunlight and fine golden dust up the hill and over. Kezia bit her lip, but Lottie, carefully finding her handkerchief first, set up a wail, "Mother! Grandma!" Mrs. Samuel Josephs, like a huge, warm, black silk tea cosy, enveloped her. "It's all right, my dear. Be a brave child. You come and play in the nursery." She put her arm around weeping Lottie and led her away. Kezia followed, making a face at Mrs. Samuel Joseph's placket, which was undone as usual, with two long pink corset laces hanging out of it. Lottie's weeping died down as she mounted the stairs, but the sight of her at the nursery door with swollen eyes and a blob of a nose gave great satisfaction to the S.J.'s, who sat on two benches before a long table covered with American cloth and set out with immense plates of bread and dripping and two brown jugs that faintly steamed. "Oh, you've been crying. Oh, don't her eyes look gone right in? Doesn't her nose look funny? You're all red and patchy." Lottie was quite a success. She felt it and smiled, and swelled, smiling timidly. "Go and sit by Zadie, ducky," said Mrs. Samuel Josephs, and Kezia, you sit at the head by Moses. Moses grinned and gave her a nip as she sat down, but she pretended not to notice. She did hate boys. Which will you have? Asked Stanley, leaning across the table very politely and smiling at her. Which will you have to begin with? Strawberries and cream or bread and dripping? Oh, strawberries and cream, please, said Kezia. Ah, how they all laughed and beat the table with their teaspoons. Wasn't that a take-in? Wasn't it now? Didn't he fox her good old Stan? Ma, she thought it was real. Even Mrs. Samuel Josephs, pouring out the milk and water, could not help smiling. Oh, you mustn't tease them on their last day, she wheezed. But Kezia bit a big piece out of her bread and dripping and then stood the piece up on her plate. With the bite out, it made a dear little sort of gate. She didn't care. A tear rolled down her cheek. But she wasn't crying. She couldn't have cried in front of those awful Samuel Josephs. She sat with her head bent, and as the tear dripped slowly down, she caught it with a neat little whisk of her tongue and ate it before any of them had seen. After tea, Kezia wandered back to their own house. Slowly, she walked up the back steps and through the scullery into the kitchen. Nothing was left in it but a lump of gritty yellow soap in one corner of the kitchen windowsill and a piece of flannel stained with a blue bag in another. The fireplace was choked up with rubbish. She poked among it, but found nothing except a hair tidy with a heart painted on it that had belonged to the servant girl. Even that she left lying, and she trailed through the narrow passage into the drawing room. The Venetian blind was pulled down but not drawn close. Long pencil rays of sunlight shone through, and the wavy shadow of a bush outside danced on the gold lines. Now it was still, now it began to flutter again, and now it came almost as far as her feet. Zoom, zoom! A blue bottle knocked against the ceiling. The carpet tacks had little bits of red fluff sticking to them. The dining room window had a square of coloured glass at each corner. One was blue and one was yellow. Kezia bent down to have one more look at the blue lawn with blue iron lilies growing at the gate, and then at the yellow lawn with yellow lilies and a yellow fence. As she looked, a little Chinese Lottie came out on the lawn and began to dust the tables and chairs with the corner of her pinafore. Was that really Lottie? Kezia was not quite sure until she had a look through the ordinary window. Kezia, Lottie called cheerfully. The storeman's here. Everything's on the dray, and 3 horses, Kezia. Mrs. Samuel Josephs has given us a big shawl to wear round us, and she says to button up your coat. She won't come out because of asthma. Lottie was very important. Now then, you kids, called the storeman. He hooked his big thumbs under their arms, and up they swung. Lottie arranged the shawl most beautifully, and the storeman tucked up their feet in a piece of old blanket. Lift up, easy does it. They might have been a couple of young ponies. The storeman felt over the cords holding his load, unhooked the brake chain from the wheel, and whistling, he swung up beside them. Keep close to me, said Lottie, because otherwise you pull the shawl away from my side, Kezia. But Kezia edged up to the storeman. He towered beside her, big as a giant, and he smelled of nuts and new wooden boxes. It was the first time that Lottie and Kezia had ever been out so late. Everything looked different. The painted wooden houses, far smaller than they did by day, the gardens far bigger and wilder, bright stars speckled in the sky, and the moon hung over the harbour, dabbling the waves with gold. They could see the lighthouse shining on Quarantine Island, and the green lights on the old coal hulks. Oh, there comes the Picton boat, said the storeman, pointing to a little steamer all hung with bright beads. But when they reached the top of the hill and began to go down the other side, the harbour disappeared, and although they were still in the town, they were quite lost. Other carts rattled past. Everybody knew the storeman. Night, Fred. Night, all, he shouted. Where are we now? Every few minutes one of the children asked him the question. Oh, this is Hawk Street, or Charlotte Crescent. Of course it is, Lottie pricked up her ears at the last name. She always felt that Charlotte Crescent belonged specially to her. Very few people had streets with the same name as theirs. Look, Kezia, there's Charlotte Crescent. Doesn't it look different? Now everything familiar was left behind. Now the big dray rattled into unknown country, along new roads with high clay banks on either side, up steep hills, down into bushy valleys, through wide shallow rivers, further and further. Lottie's head wagged. She drooped. She slipped half into Kezia's lap and lay there. But Kezia couldn't keep her eyes open wide enough. The wind blew and she shivered, but her cheeks and ears burned. Do stars ever blow out? She asked. Not to notice, said the storeman. We've got an uncle and an aunt living near our new house, said Kezia. They've got 2 children, Pip, the eldest is called, and the youngest name is Rags. He's got a ram. He has to feed it with an Emmanuel teapot and a glove top over the spout. And he's going to show us. What's the difference between a ram and a sheep? Well, a ram has horns and runs for you. Kezia considered. I don't want to see it frightfully. I hate rushing animals like dogs and parrots. I often dream that animals rush at me, even camels, and while they're rushing, their heads swell enormous. The storeman said nothing. Kezia peered up at him, screwing up her eyes. Then she put her finger out and stroked his sleeve. It felt hairy. Are we near? She asked. Not far off now, answered the storeman. Getting tired? Well, I'm not an atom bit sleepy, she said, but my eyes keep curling up in such a funny sort of way. She gave a long sigh, and to stop her eyes from curling, she shut them. When she opened them again, they were clanking through a drive that cut through the garden like a whiplash, looping suddenly an island of green, and behind the island, but out of sight until you came upon it, was the house. It was long and low built, with a pilloried veranda and balcony all the way round. The soft white bulk of it lay stretched upon the green garden like a sleeping beast. And now one and now another of the windows leapt into light. Someone was walking through the empty rooms carrying a lamp. From the window downstairs, the light of a fire flickered. A strange, beautiful excitement seemed to stream from the house in quivering ripples. Where are we? Said Lottie, sitting up. Her reefer cap was all on one side, and on her cheek there was the print of an anchor button she had pressed against while she was sleeping. Tenderly, the storeman lifted her, set her cap straight, and pulled down her crumpled clothes. She stood blinking on the lowest veranda step, watching Kezia, who seemed to come flying through the air to her feet. Oh, cried Kezia, flinging up her arms. The grandmother came out of the dark hall, carrying a little lamp. She was smiling. You found your way in the dark, said she. Perfectly well. But Lottie staggered on the lowest veranda step, like a bird fallen out of the nest. If she stood still for a moment, she fell asleep. If she leaned against anything, her eyes closed. She could not walk another step. They were taken off to bed by the grandmother. She went first with a candle. The stairs rang to their climbing feet. Isabel and Lottie lay in a room to themselves. Kezia curled in her grandmother's soft bed. Aren't there going to be any sheets, my grandma? No, not tonight. It's tickly, said Kezia, but it's like Indians. She dragged her grandmother down to her and kissed her under the chin. Come to bed soon and be my Indian brave. What a silly you are, said the old woman, tucking her in as she loved to be tucked. Aren't you going to leave me a candle? No. Shh. Go to sleep. Well, can I have the door left open? She rolled herself up into a round, but she did not go to sleep. From all over the house came the sound of steps. The house itself creaked and popped. Loud whispering voices came from downstairs. Once she heard Aunt Beryl's rush of high laughter, and once she heard a loud trumpeting from Burnell blowing his nose. Outside the window, hundreds of black cats with yellow eyes sat in the sky watching her, but she wasn't frightened. Lottie was saying to Isabel, "I'm going to say my prayers in bed tonight." "No, you can't, Lottie," Isabel was very firm. "God only excuses you saying your prayers in bed if you've got a temperature." So Lottie yielded. "Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, look upon a little child, pity me, simple Lizzie, suffer me to come to thee." And then they lay down back to back, their little behinds just touching, and fell asleep. Dawn came sharp and chill, with red clouds on a faint green sky and drops of water on every leaf and blade. A breeze blew over the garden, dropping dew and dropping petals, shivered over the drenched paddocks, and was lost in the sombre bush. In the sky, some tiny stars floated for a moment, and then they were gone. They were dissolved like bubbles. And plain to be heard in the early quiet was the sound of the creek in the paddock, running over the brown stones, running in and out of sandy hollows, spilling into a swamp of yellow waterflowers and cresses. And then at the first beam of the sun, the birds began. Big cheeky birds, starlings and miners, whistled on the lawns. The little birds, the goldfinches and linnets and fantails, flicked from bough to bough. A lovely kingfisher perched on the paddock fence, preening his rich beauty, and a tui sang his 3 notes and laughed and sang them again. Pat came swinging along. In his hand he held a little tomahawk that winked in the sun. "Come with me," he said to the children, "and I'll show you how the kings of Ireland chop the head off a duck." They drew back. They didn't believe him. Besides, the Troupe boys had never seen Pat before. "Come on now," he coaxed, smiling and holding his hand out to Kezia. "Is it a real duck's head? One from the paddock?" "It is," said Pat. She put her hand in his hard, dry one, and he stuck the tomahawk in his belt and held out the other to Rags. He loved little children. "I'd better keep hold of Snooker's head if there's going to be any blood about," said Pip, "because the sight of blood makes him awfully wild." He ran ahead, dragging Snooker by the handkerchief. "Do you think we ought to go?" whispered Isabel. "We haven't asked anything, have we?" At the bottom of the orchard gate was set. At the bottom of the orchard, a gate was set in the paling fence. On the other side, a steep bank led down to a bridge that spanned the creek, and once up the bank on the other side, you were on the fringe of the paddocks. A little old stable in the first paddock had been turned into a fowl house. The fowls had strayed far away across the paddock and down to a dumping ground in a hollow, but the ducks kept close to that part of the creek that flowed under the bridge. Tall bushes overhung the stream with red leaves and yellow flowers and clusters of blackberries. At some places the stream was wide and shallow, but at others it tumbled into deep little pools with foam at the edges and quivering bubbles. It was in these pools that the big white ducks had made themselves at home, swimming and guzzling along the weedy banks. Up and down they swam, preening their dazzling breasts, and other ducks with the same dazzling breasts and yellow bills swam upside down with them. "There's the little Irish Navy," said Pat, "and look at the old Admiral there with the green neck and the grand little flagstaff on his tail." He pulled a handful of grain from his pocket and began to walk towards the fowl house, lazy, his straw hat with a broken crown pulled over his eyes. "Leg, leg, 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 leg," he called. "Quack, quack, quack, quack," answered the ducks, making for land, and flapping and scrambling up the bank. They streamed after him a long waddling line. He coaxed them, pretending to throw the grain, shaking it in his hands and calling to them until they swept round him in a white ring. From far away the fowls heard the clamour, and they too came running across the paddock, their heads thrust forward, their wings spread, turning in their feet in the silly way fowls run and scolding as they came. Then Pat scattered the grain and the greedy ducks began to gobble. Quickly, he stooped, seized two, one under each arm, and strode across to the children. Their darting heads and round eyes frightened the children, all except Pip. "Come on, sillies," he cried. "They can't bite. They haven't any teeth. They've only got those two little holes in their beaks for breathing through." "Will you hold one while I finish the other?" asked Pat. Pat let go of Snooker. Won't I? Give us one. Don't mind how much it kicks." He nearly sobbed with delight when Pat gave the white lump into his arms. There was an old stump beside the door of the fowl house. Pat grabbed the duck by the legs, laid it flat across the stump, and almost at the same moment, down came the little tomahawk and the duck's head flew off the stump. Up the blood spurted over the white feathers and over his hand. When the children saw the blood, they were frightened no longer. They crowded round him and began to scream. Even Isabel leapt about, crying, "The blood! The blood!" Pip forgot all about his duck. He simply threw it away from him and shouted, "I saw it! I saw it!" and jumped round the wood block. Rags, with cheeks as white as paper, ran up to the little head, put out a finger as if he wanted to touch it, shrank back again, and then again put out a finger. He was shivering all over. Even Lottie, frightened little Lottie, began to laugh and pointed at the duck and shrieked, "Look, Kezia, look!" "Watch it!" shouted Pat. He put down the body and it began to waddle away with only a long spurt of blood where the head had been. It began to pad away without a sound towards the steep bank that led to the stream. That was the crowning wonder. "Do you see that? Do you see that?" yelled Pip. He ran among the little girls tugging at their pinafores. "Oh, it's like a little engine. It's like a funny little railway engine," squealed Isabel. But Kezia suddenly rushed at Pat and flung her arms round his legs and butted her head as hard as she could against his knees. "Put head back! Put head back!" she screamed. When he stopped to move her away, she would not let go or take her head away. She held on as hard as she could and sobbed, "Head back, until it sounded like a loud, strange hiccup. "It's stopped. It's tumbled over. It's dead," said Pip. Pat dragged Kezia up into his arms. Her sunbonnet had fallen back, but she would not let him look at her face. No, she pressed her face into a bone in his shoulder and clasped her hands round his neck. The children stopped screaming as suddenly as they had begun. They stood around the dead duck. Rags was not frightened of the head anymore. He knelt down and stroked it now. "I don't think the head's quite dead yet," he said. "Do you think it would keep alive if I gave it something to drink?" But Pip got very cross. "Oh, bah, you baby!" He whistled to Snooker and went off. When Isabel went up to Lottie, Lottie snatched away. "What are you always touching me for, Isabel?" "There now," said Pat to Kezia. "There's the grand little girl." She put up her hands and touched his ears. She felt something. Slowly she raised her quivering face and looked. Pat wore little round earrings. She never knew that men wore earrings. She was very much surprised. "Do they come on and off?" she asked huskily.